So I'm going to do something a little bit different, well, a lot different. I want to talk about how these three books are the overflow of Lewis's scholarly research and his broad reading life. These are the covers of the first American edition, but it was not a trilogy in the traditional sense. He did not set out to write a three-volume sequence. He set out to write one book, one story out of the Silent Planet. And only some years later did he have an idea for another book, which he started and never finished. And there's a huge controversy over the Dark Tower and whether or not it's Lewis's. I have no doubt that it was Lewis's, but the reason he didn't finish it is because he didn't think it was going anywhere. But then he wrote Perelandra, and that was freestanding all by itself, and that was it. Only then he had an idea for another book. And so it wound up being three books that use Arthur Ransom and the world that he created in Out of the Silent Planet, but it wasn't envisioned as a three-part series any more than the Chronicles of Narnia were envisioned as a seven-book sequence. He had an idea for a book, and he wrote that book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Then he had an idea for another book, which became The Magician's Nephew, only it stalled, and he laid it aside and had an idea for another book, so he wrote Prince Caspian. So he was always generating ideas. I don't think he understood the concept of writer's block. But in a notice that would be the closest to a preface he wrote to Perelandra when it came out, he made just this brief statement, and it's printed on the copyright page. This story can be read by itself, but it is also a sequel to Out of the Silent Planet, in which some account was given of Ransom's adventures in Mars, or, as the inhabitants call it, Malacandra. So that's a bit of the background. Let's look at Out of the Silent Planet. Lewis's great academic book, his first big book that he wrote for the purpose of establishing his reputation and setting off his career, was The Allegory of Love. It was a project that took about 10 years, and it's a study of medieval allegorical courtly love poetry. It's brilliant. It is amazing. It is still in print. Academic books go out of print after about 3 years. The idea that it is still in print almost, 90 years later. It was published in 1936. So 85 years? It's almost unprecedented, almost unheard of. It's the gold standard, and many people disagree with him and his approach, including a number of his students who went on to have major careers in England and the United States. They may disagree with some of his interpretation, but if you're writing about the period, you have to start with Lewis. You have to interact with Lewis. So this is this major book. When I teach my course on C.S. Lewis, I spend 3 weeks on The Allegory of Love, which seems very strange, except almost everything else he wrote is overflow from The Allegory of Love. For instance, David mentioned the abolition of man this morning. In the abolition of man, Lewis talks about the relationship between the head, the belly, and the chest, which is an idea he first introduces in the allegory of love. In the Four Loves, Lewis discusses philia, love, friendship; storge, love, affection; eros, love, romance. Notice I didn't say sex. Romance. And that New Testament idea of agape. He first discusses this in the allegory of love. In the allegory of love, his biggest focus is on a kind of story that he fell in love with as a teenager. And this story captivated him. Now remember, he fell in love with Norse mythology in his late adolescence, about 1910. He was not his late adolescence, his early adolescence. He was about 12 years old. Came across some pictures in a magazine from the illustrated edition, Arthur Rackham's illustrations of the Wagner's Ring of the Nibelungen. And David showed one of the pictures from that collection. That sparked it. It was the visual. The visual sparked his interest. We think of him with words. If you look at Lewis, he's highly visual. So many of his stories began with a picture in his mind. So he's a highly visual person. And so he started devouring stories of Norse mythology. One of the people in the 19th century who was retelling Norse mythology was William Morris. Now, William Morris was a key figure in literature. He influenced art. He influenced architecture and home decoration. He's the one that wanted to restore all the arts and crafts that had been lost in the Industrial Revolution. So he had some factories that produced tiles, and any late Victorian home had these tiles around their fireplace, and he produced wallpaper. And you know, in the late Victorian period, wallpaper was everything. Every room had wallpaper. A nice touch that the design artist added to my biography of Lewis, on each of the 3 volumes, in the center of the cover, there's a picture of Lewis and some words, but around the edging, those are actually William Morris's wallpaper designs. And so that's the connection. Lewis was just taken with all of that. So he read anything he could find from William Morris, and he came upon William Morris's book, The Well at the End of the World. The Well at the End of the World. And it's a story about the hero who goes on a quest to the end of the world to achieve that great thing. And you fill in the blank for what the great thing is. You go to the end, and in the course of the journey, you have to dream the impossible dream. You must beat the unbeatable foe. You must, go where the brave dare not go, march into hell for a heavenly cause. Cervantes' Don Quixote is a satire on the kind of stories that Lewis was falling in love with. So the hero goes to the end of the world. He does all of this. He fights and defends the honor of the great lady. And then he returns a different person. In the course of the journey and in the course of acquiring the pearl of great price, in which he gives up everything, sacrifices everything, abandons everything to achieve this great whatever it is. Having done that, he returns a different person. He loved that story. And then he realized William Morris was copying that story from the kind of story that was being written in the Middle Ages. And the most famous is The Quest for the Holy Grail. And so he found that in Malory's The Death of Arthur, Le Mort d'Arthur. Then he found it in Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queen, which he writes about. It's the last section of his book, The Allegory of Love. It's also the last academic scholarly book of his that was published. Only it's one of his students, Alistair Fowler, edited Lewis's notes and published it a year or two after Lewis died. But anyway, it was something he was concerned with all his life. Lastly, he came upon it in a railway station. He was a teenager living in Great Bookham with W.T. Kirkpatrick, and he would walk to Dorking to get his hair cut. It was only 10 miles. And but sometimes he would take the train back because the train station had a bookstall. And there in the bookstall, he picked up a copy of George MacDonald's Phantastes. And that word is pronounced about 12 different ways. Phantastes, Phantastes, as in fantasy. Goodness only knows the right way to pronounce it. Where's Dale? You know how to pronounce it?
I'd say fantastic.
So, there are a lot of wrong ways to do it. We just don't know the right way to do it. So here's this story that Lewis falls in love with, and he's discussing it in The Allegory of Love, and it's about this hero that takes the journey, but it's the journey there and back again. I would argue that Tolkien got the idea for his plots for both The Hobbit and for The Lord of the Rings from Lewis, because those, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are not the kind of stories that Tolkien wrote. For 20 years, since the middle of World War I, Tolkien had been working on his history of Middle-earth, the Silmarillion, from the First Age to the Third Age. Does he go to the Fourth Age? And it goes from myth to legend to saga, to history, different forms of literature in the Silmarillion. But what all the stories have in common is they're about despair, doom, death, destruction, desolation. There are no happy endings in the Silmarillion because they're based on the old Norse stories, and the Norse stories, the Norse mythologies, have no basis for hope. There is no hope in Norse mythology. But then all of a sudden, in the early 1930s, Tolkien once again has a story he can't finish. Remember, he was still working on the Silmarillion when he died. And it was his son, Christopher, who finally edited it and published it. But he couldn't get anywhere with The Hobbit. At the same time, he and Lewis were meeting once a week, reading to one another what they were working on. Lewis was working on The Allegory of Love. And so I suspect that this idea of the plot where the person goes on the quest for the great thing and then returns a different person with a happy ending, a bag full of gold, came from Lewis. Tolkien vociferously denied that he got any ideas from anybody else, that anybody ever influenced him whatsoever. Everything was exclusively within his own head, which betrays, I think, an amazing lack of self-awareness. And we won't go into all of that. But I just want to say you've got the same plot in The Hobbit that you've got in The Lord of the Rings. Frodo goes there on the great quest to do the great deed, and he returns, but he's a different Frodo when he returns. And there's a bit of sorrow, but going from the Grey Havens across and making the voyage isn't so bad. Isn't that the blessed hope? Yeah, so there's a bit of pathos. On the other hand, it's not so bad, is it? I'm going to die. That's sad. I'm going to go to heaven. That's not so bad, is it? So you've got this influence. And at that point, once the Hobbit is out of the way and the allegory of love is out of the way, Lewis and Tolkien have this idea, okay, we can't find the kind of stories we like. I would argue that Tolkien really hated the modern world and modern literature. He did not like modern literature at all. And so they were going to write the kind of book that ought to be written. So Lewis writes the space travel story, and Tolkien starts the time travel story, and that's it with poor Tolkien. He just can't finish anything. Not just his fiction, also his scholarship. He just can't. He's brilliant. He's a brilliant philologist, but he bogs down and grinds to a halt. His perfectionism is his enemy. So Lewis writes a story, and it's a medieval romance. It may have a rocket ship, but it's the same story there and back again, and in the course of the journey, Ransom becomes a different person. So that's the idea of the overflow of Lewis's scholarship. It's affecting him, and that's why I spend so much time with the allegory of love, because it sets up virtually all of Lewis's biggest concerns, and it provides him with a plot that he's going to use in Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra. Even that hideous strength, and David mentioned this earlier today, Jane's journey isn't very far. It's to St. Anne's. It's not a long journey, but it is a life-changing journey. Her husband's journey to Nice, again, it's not a long journey, and it's a more violent journey. And all of us have different journeys. And for some people, the conversion is always a bit traumatic. But for some, it takes a bigger piece of wood to get knocked upside the head than for other people to be changed. And Mark needed a bigger stick of wood to get knocked upside the head than Jane did. But anyway, it's that journey and becoming a different person. Let's see what we've got here. This is a different cover, David. That's the 1952 paperback pan edition of Out of the Silent Planet. There they are in the spaceship going to the red planet. Lot of science fiction movies coming out in the 1950s. Is anyone of a certain age to remember some of those things? The Blob. Oh, golly. There's one, the 49 paperback. I think this may be the first paperback edition. I'm not sure. But there you have the Rosa, and oh, look at these. Sorn. Can you see the Sorns there? Golly. No, they don't know what they look like. Well, they look like Gimli, don't they? At the same time, in the mid-40s, that he's writing Paralandra and That Hideous Strength, he's also beginning to address the problem of scientism, the confusion of a particular philosophy, materialism, naturalism, with science. And that Lewis is not anti-science. In fact, he's fascinated by science. In Mere Christianity, he has a lot of discussions about Einstein's theory of relativity and how it affects its implications for such things as prayer and the transcendent. So he's vitally interested and fascinated in science. And in a sense, what he's doing is protecting science as much as theology from confusing different philosophical ideas with the science. So, will we lose God in outer space? And the answer is no. But all sorts of questions that will be coming up. And obviously, he's addressing one of these, a major one, at the end of Out of the Silent Planet, when Weston is giving his defense of the conquest of all the universe. So let's see. David mentioned that that Lewis originally submitted his manuscript to Tolkien's publisher. Allen and Unwin published The Hobbit. It was a quick success, and they wanted a sequel, another children's storybook. And Tolkien said, okay, because Tolkien's big preoccupation is, I need a little more money, because he had 4 children to educate in private school, and so he was always preoccupied with money. So he's going to write this book, going to get a little more money, doesn't have a plot, doesn't have a story, doesn't know what he's writing about. But he tells Lewis, okay, send your book to Allen Unwin, and I'll write too and help. So the reader at Allen and Unwin didn't really care for Out of the Silent Planet. And so Unwin wrote to Tolkien and said, okay, what's your honest opinion of it? So Tolkien says, oh, I was enthralled by it. I was absolutely enthralled by it. But, quote, my first criticism was simply that it was too short. I still think that criticism holds for both practical and artistic reasons. Other criticisms concerning narrative style, Lewis is always apt to have rather creaking, stiff-jointed passages, inconsistent details in the plot, and philology have since been corrected to my satisfaction. The author holds to items of linguistic invention that do not appeal to me. Malacandra, Mal-el-Dil. El-Dilla, in any case, I suspect to be due to the influence of Eldar in the Silmarillion. But this is a matter of taste. Well, with help from friends like that. Golly. And David pointed out that the etymology of Malacandra, Malak, you know the name Melchizedek. So Malak is king, Zedek is righteousness, so Melchizedek is the king of righteousness. So this idea of king, the planet of the king, the etymology is Hebrew. It's not Old Elvish. And Eldillah, if you've hung around church any time at all, you know that El is the Hebrew word for God. And so we get Bethel, Bethel, house of God. And so I think Tolkien is imposing something on Lewis's work that is sad, if not unfortunate. But anyway, Tolkien would always hold a grudge against Lewis for stealing his words and putting them in his science fiction. Now, the books function apologetically. At the end of the war, end of World War II, Lewis was invited to give a lecture to some youth ministers on how to do apologetics. So we've got teenagers and they're asking questions, so how do we do apologetics? So he gave a little lecture. It was published. It's found in God in the Dock, a little essay on apologetics, Christian apologetics. And he was talking about some scientific questions that he deals with in the science fiction and in miracles and in Mere Christianity and in some essays. He said, but while we're on this subject, what we need is not more little Christian books. What we need is more books by Christians on every subject with the Christianity latent. And that's what he's doing with his fiction. The Christianity runs through all of his fiction, but he's not preaching. You know, he's not explaining the point. You see it in the Chronicles of Narnia. But in this particular book, Out of Silent Planet, he includes it's not just apologetic, it's evangelistic, because he includes basic points of the gospel. For instance, Mal-el-Dil the Young made the world and lives with the old one. First point of the creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. And then he discusses the problem of human nature. You know, our glory is we're made in the image of God. Our tragedy is we come short of the glory of God. So the problem of being bent. And he does it without any theological terminology. He doesn't use the language of Zion. Then the rebellion of the Oyarsa of Tholkandra and his Eldillah, and why this is the silent planet. The war in heaven, in which the Oyarsa of Tholkandra battles the Oyarsa of Malacandra. And Mel-el-Dil shows the Eldillah of Malacandra how to bind the Oyarsa of Tholkandra so that he falls out of heaven and he's bound on Tholkandra. bound on earth. Revelation 13, the fall of Satan. And then the incarnation, the atonement, and the resurrection. There was a great war, and we drove him back out of the heavens and bound him in the air of his own world. Why in the air? The prince of the air. The air of his own world, as Mal-el-Dil taught us. There, doubtless, he lies to this hour, and we know no more of that planet. Angels are not omniscient. They're not all-powerful. They're not omnipresent. They're limited. It is silent. We think that Mal-el-Dil would not give it up utterly to the bent one. That just doesn't seem reasonable that he'd give it up. And there are stories among us that he has taken strange counsel and dared terrible things, wrestling with the bent one in Thalkandra. That idea of the wrestling, this was the way the early church for the first 400 years explained the atonement of Christ defeating Satan, wrestling with Satan, destroying Satan. But of this we know less than you. It is a thing we desire to look into. Reference that David made this morning. Let's look at Paralandra. It's the problem of over-preparing, isn't it? Screw tape letters. What does that have to do with it? Now, first of all, Paralandra follows the same plot as of There and Back Again, but it's even more this story of the medieval romance, for in this one, it's the fairy queen, that story in which the knight is defending the honor of the great lady. He is the champion for the great lady. And so it's almost one-to-one a telling of that. So he starts it with the picture of the floating islands, and whereas Tolkien denied that he got ideas from anywhere, Lewis was scouring his whole reading experience for straw to make his bricks. Now, Tolkien explained this in an essay he wrote on fairy stories, that God is the creator, but we are sub-creators, and we make things out of things. And Tolkien did too. He just didn't admit it. Lewis, on the other hand, floating islands appear in one of his very favorite stories. He read it over and over. He was entranced by it the first time he read it in Greek, the Odyssey. And in the Odyssey, Aeolia is a floating island. You know, we get Aeolian harps and that sort of thing. So Aeolia is this floating island. So he's drawing things from everywhere. But once you've got something like that, he said this in an interview the summer before he died for a science fiction magazine. The starting point of the second novel, Paralandra, was my mental picture of the floating islands. The whole of the rest of my labors, in a sense, consisted of building up a world in which floating islands could exist. And then, of course, the story about an averted fall developed. This is because, as you know, having got your people to this exciting country, something must happen. And this is another point at which Lewis and Tolkien differed. Lewis is concerned with the action of a story. Tolkien is concerned with talk. And when he was writing The Lord of the Rings, It went on and on and on with just talk between the hobbits. And Lewis said, something's got to happen. Cut out all of this talk and these jokes. You're just practicing with your language. They've got to do something. So Lewis is really emphatic. Something's got to happen. The story of this averted fall, he says, came in very conveniently. Of course, it wouldn't have been this particular story if I wasn't interested in those particular ideas on other grounds. Well, what other grounds? Why was he interested in this particular story? On Monday, January the 29th, 1940, Lewis and Tolkien escorted Charles Williams, their new friend, to the Divinity School. It's a building that's hooked on to the Bodleian Library. The Bodleian, it came first, and the Bodleian Library was built adjacent to it. If you've seen any of the Harry Potter movies, it's the room in which Professor McGonagall teaches Ron Weasley how to dance. In another place, it's the room where Harry Potter is in the hospital. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous room. And there, in that room, Charles Williams delivered a lecture on Milton. Well, Lewis thought it was the cat's meow. Milton had been out of favor. People weren't really studying Milton anymore at that point. And Lewis said, by gum, by golly, I'm going to have to look at Milton some more. So he went back and looked at Milton, and he was invited to deliver lectures at the University of North Wales. And for that lecture, he addressed Paradise Lost. That lectureship was then edited, and he published it as a preface to Paradise Lost. And for all intents and purposes, Lewis put Paradise Lost back on the agenda of English faculties in the English-speaking world. It began to be studied again. A Preface to Paradise Lost is still in print. So what's that, 75 years? No, 80 years later? And if you're going to write about Paradise Lost, you have to deal with Lewis. Because again, he's the gold standard. Many people, obviously, in our present environment disagree with Lewis, but they have to deal with him. I tested this a few years ago, and went through a university library just pulling monographs on Paradise Lost off the shelf, and sure enough, there's the footnote to Lewis. He's there. You have to deal with him. Okay, so Williams gave his lecture. Lewis is getting interested in Paradise Lost. On July the 21st, 1940, once he was dealing with Paradise Lost, and he's writing to his brother Warney, who is has been called back up, and he's in France. The phony war is going on. And in almost every letter, Lewis quotes from Paradise Lost. So he's consuming it at this point. In 1940, July of 1940, he goes to church. Have you ever had to endure a terrible sermon? I have. I was usually preaching it. And it brings you, does wonders for your spiritual relationship, because you're preaching and you're also praying, oh Lord, just get me through this sermon. I'll go to any mission field. Just get me through this sermon. No sacrifice too great. Just get me through this sermon. And usually something remarkable happens. Well, he was going through, enduring this dreadful sermon, and his mind was wandering. Now, at this point in his life, he's very much concerned with temptation, spiritual dynamics, what's going on with temptation. About this time, he starts going to a confessor, not a Catholic priest, but an Anglican priest who will hear confession, a spiritual director. And so he's fascinated by this temptation idea and his mind wandering in the service, because what his mind wanders to is one devil giving advice to another devil on how to tempt his patient. And so this is the beginning of the screw tape letters. And so you've got the screw tape letters, a preface to Paradise Lost, and then finally Paralandra comes out of that. So again, it's the overflow of what he's working on and thinking about that generates ideas. By the way, every one of you has a novel in you. Some of you are interested in writing, some of you aren't. But in writing, the most important thing to do is capture an idea when it comes to you. So you have to write it down on anything, any scrap of paper. Write down the basic idea, and your mind will retrieve the whole idea later when you're at your computer. But if you wait until you get to your computer, you'll remember, I had a great idea. I just can't remember what the idea was. Have you ever had that experience? So Lewis is always jotting down ideas. He doesn't necessarily work on all of them, but he captures the idea. So there's this tradition then, if you want to call it that, chain of ideas he's dealing with about satanic influence, temptation, and how it comes into the world. And he does it in a scholarly way in Preface to Paradise Lost. He does it in a facetious way with Screwtape Letters. He does it in a profound literary way with Paralandra. But it's that same idea that he's very much concerned with, that the church is under assault, and the war's not the biggest problem. That's not the biggest problem. Christians deal with persecution very well. It's prosperity we don't handle very well. Let's see. Now, remember that Tolkien was with Lewis when they heard Charles Williams' lecture. A few days after the death of Lewis in 1963, Tolkien wrote to his son Michael to say that Charles Williams had no influence on Lewis's science fiction novels except for That Hideous Strength. I think that's generally understood, that he had a big influence on That Hideous Strength. But he also is the prime driver in Paralandra, because it was that emphasis on Milton and Paradise Lost that gave Lewis the idea of what would it be like if Adam and Eve had not succumbed to the temptation? What would that have been like? And that's the supposal that frames a lot of Lewis's fiction. This illustration, you used it, David, was in an issue of Horizon, which was a hardbound magazine, journal that was published in the 50s. And this one has so much, it's crowded with all of the different creatures and plants and things, but fascinating. Lewis received a lot of attention for his science fiction. 60 reviews. I don't get 60 reviews. Do you get 60 reviews? Don, you get 60 reviews? No. But so he's on the cover of the Saturday Review. This is several years before he makes the cover of Time magazine. And there's one you've already seen, there's one we've seen, there's one we've seen. A student of mine did this one. There's the floating islands. This is an audiobook cover, and that brings us to That Hideous Strength. And here again, it's the short journey, but That Hideous Strength is written during World War II. It's not published until after the war, but he's actually working on it before D-Day. So he is envisioning an Allied victory long before the victory comes. So that because before Lewis was a Christian, he was a profound. After he became a Christian, he has hope. He becomes an optimist. Their number is changed as a person as a result of it's his character. I would not have enjoyed as a teenager. I would not let my daughters but that hideous strength, he sets it in a university. Winnie the Pooh liked stories, but mainly he liked. And this is my favorite of the house. I live in a university, and the political, before I surrendered to preach, and it was a surrender, it was unconditional surrender, and you won't be involved in politics anymore. I'm leaving, I was in, okay, so I've left all of that behind me. Seminary and church, and oh no, there's politics, and I'm not allowed to be involved in that, which is because in my denomination, in the beginning in the late 1970s, if my enemies are not your enemies, are my enemy. And it's been my entire has been played out, both at the denominational level, in which a ring. And so he discusses the inner ring isn't just in the university, it's in every organization, it's in every church. What we will do to get to be in the inner ring. So it's much more experiential than the other two books they loved. But now he's talking about his environment. In our environment, it's time. And so I think just a couple of minutes or 3 minutes to do any question, just a few moments. If you've got a question, be happy to address it. Yes?
Challenges to a lot of readers of That Hideous Strength, and I've heard this from many people. What is
the first time, I almost fell out of my chair. because you're going to make Hemingway or Fiddlistic, and then all of a sudden, here's Merlin. Come on. Now, this would be the influence of Williams, because shockers, these supernatural thrillers in which it's into the everyday. Now, this is what Tolkien is talking fairy stories. In fairy stories, the fabric between the everworld breaks. Now, and that writes fairy stories. And remember, he says of this one, it's a fairy story. That happens, you've got to have this veil between the to break. Otherwise, it's not a fairy story. Okay, so it's the wardrobe that's the connect, or it's the rings. You know, and with Wizard of Oz, it's the ruby slippers. With Alice in Wonderland, or Alice Through the Looking Glass, it's the Looking Glass. So you got this between the worlds. Oddly enough, Tolkien, fairy stories in there for us, doesn't write fairy stories. Writing a kind of story of a different age and a different time, sort of thing. But they're not fairy stories. And so that's what he's doing. He's writing a fairy story, and to do that, you've got to have something that's been popping up. Golly. Dale?
Unlike Tolkien, where he gets some of these ideas, like the Donald, you know, from Fantastic.
Yeah, yeah.
It's also interesting that his in English, all that quite as well, but Milton or Bunyan aren't allegorical in
Yeah, he go.
but not one for one.
In fact, in one of those little introductions to, I think it's Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis says, none of the characters in this story are real people, and none of them are allegorical. Yes, sir.
Time travel. Have you read anything that Tolkien wrote on time travel, his notes or?
He started one. It's in Lost.
Yeah, the Lost Road.
The Lost Road. The Lost Road. It's a fragment, and
He has a story called The Notion Club, which is like the Inklings, but
Yeah.
it's set in the 1980s. So there's some kind of a time displacement there.
but not unfinished, left unfinished. Yeah, he had other fish to fry, and we're glad he fried those other fish. I mean, let's face it, The Lord of the Rings is a monumental achievement. I think it's one of the greatest pieces of prose narrative written in the last 500 years, because it changed the nature of storytelling in the second half of the 20th century. And it continues to have this massive impact. So monumental. So he didn't finish the time travel story. So what? Y'all have a great lunch. Do we have any announcements before we go?